I think all you're going to hear about over the course of the next few weeks or whatever, and the only story that is going to be told is the story, is Cyberpunk a good game or not? And I think that misses such an important aspect of what makes this game interesting. And it's what I want to talk about today, which is basically, why did this game supersede every other game? Why is it like literally the most hyped game of all time? And it's just people are beloved of this game. They are so dedicated to this game in a way that nobody has ever been dedicated to any kind of game before. I think that's the actual interesting story around Cyberpunk, and it's the one that I want to break down today. It's the one I've done a lot of prep to break down today. That I want to explain why has marketing essentially worked in this way that no other game has done it before, and why doesn't that work for companies like EA or Activision that have like way more money and like the same kind of budget for their AAA games for marketing, but it doesn't like create this sense of hype and that sort of thing. And what we'll learn is that Cyberpunk actually did some things, particularly one really big thing that I think made this game different from any other game that's come before it. And that is the essence of our talk. But first, we're going to talk about a story that I got inspired to tell because it made me think of this game and why things are beautiful. This is a story about a man named Musashi who wrote the Book of Five Rings, who was taught by the Zen master Suzuki, very famous swordsman in ancient Japan, one of the best samurai ever. Musashi had an undefeated record as a samurai and was basically a wandering samurai looking for any kind of challenge and anything he could overcome, and was an incredible warrior. But had gotten to a point in his life where he felt like he had reached the point of swordsmanship, the greatest he could be. He wanted to retire. He wanted to become a farmer. Didn't want to do it anymore. He saw the futility in war and killing people, etc. And so I love these stories, by the way. I very deep in Zen Buddhism, read a lot about it. So I just love these kind of stories. They all have these like really cool lessons, and this one's no exception. So Musashi heard of a warrior who had trained his entire life to fight Musashi. It's all he wanted to do. And because of that, when he's issued like an official challenge by that warrior, he had to accept it, even though he's kind of like done with swordsmanship. So this is a little bit of a complex situation because the person who challenged Musashi is this person who instructs the shogunate, the daimyo. And so he's like this big political figure as well. So they've got to have all these nobles come along, and everybody's got like they've got to plan it all out. So they decide that they're going to they're going to duel to the death on this island outside of Japan. And Musashi sends a letter along that says that he will arrive when he feels like it, basically, because he's Musashi, he doesn't care. So Musashi arrives early in the morning to the fight. When he gets there on the boat, he takes one of the oars from the boat and he sharpens it down with his sword. This is what he's going to use to fight with. Meanwhile, this other master comes up and Musashi steps off the boat and he fights on the water. But as such, when the duel begins, Musashi had so perfectly timed the moment of the battle that the sun rose behind him, reflected off the water, which blinded the other master. And because of that, Musashi was able to win the duel easily, even though he had an inferior weapon. And when he won the duel, the master looked into his eyes and he had so much happiness. He had so much pride and honor that he had been defeated. And Musashi could only weep, even though all these nobles came over and said, that was so amazing how you won this battle. And that was so, he could only get back on his boat and just cry. And because he said, that's the greatest warrior I could have ever hoped to fight. I will never fight another warrior of this quality ever again. He actually felt terrible about it because he knew that that was the peak of his existence. He could never fight a warrior that great again. And in the same way, I'm going to draw an analogy as to why Cyberpunk has succeeded where all other efforts have failed. It's because that embroiled in that story is the creation of something because of the nature and the desire to create it. It goes outside of a desire for cash. It goes outside of a desire for fame. It goes outside of a desire for anything besides the mastery of that thing. CG Projekt Red stands alone as a game studio for now. And I'm kind of the opinion that this is the last game that they will do along these lines, where they train to be the best samurai in the world in the same way that Musashi did because they wanted to do it, because of the nature of doing something like that, because of the nature of producing a beautiful game. And that stands alone, number one, as the reason as to why this game works. There are a lot of numbers we're going to be going through in this talk, and there's a lot of points I'm going to make. But starting off, I want you to understand that beyond anything else, this is a victory because of authenticity. When you see the same Call of Duty game come out over and over and over again, and it's a slight update from the last one. Now we have dudes with jetpacks. Now it's Call of Duty Medieval. Now it's Call of Duty Modern Warfare. Now it's Call of Duty Future Warfare, right? Like, you can tell that there is sort of like a manufactured kind of thing in that. It's the same with like the new Star Wars game. It's the same in movie theaters in Hollywood now, right? Like, why there is such a meaningful difference between like when Christopher Nolan makes a movie versus like when you see the next Marvel movie, right? It's like these reboots, these secondary sequels, triquels, whatever you call them, the fourth, fifth movie over and over again. It's just, you can tell that there isn't a legitimate art in that. So before we start going into the things that quantifiably make CDPR great and Cyberpunk great, I want to go into the unquantifiable, because I think it's something that nobody talks about, and it's a lot harder to understand, but if you get it, you sort of understand like why this matters so much. Cyberpunk 2077 is a story of authenticity. It's a story of people that started on a project because they had a passion to do it. I don't think that the initial push before it became a game that had $120 million of investment, before it had a group of 500 people working on it, the core of CDPR has always been about creating a game that they wanted to see in the world, because in their opinion, that game didn't exist. And that is the essence of why Cyberpunk is great. It is because it is authentic. It doesn't go towards the same lines of cash cows, like wanting a bunch of money. It doesn't follow the same rubric of making the same reboot of a game over and over again because you just want the next year's updates. It doesn't have a bunch of bullshit MTX. It's a straight $60 game traditionally, and it's an open world where everybody can enjoy it. Let's start with authenticity. That's number one. And this would not be a Devin Nash talk if we didn't have Notepad. Authenticity is number one. But the second thing is a concept called equity. Equity is, in business, means that you have some kind of investment in the company. And what CDPR has done through The Witcher is they've built equity, particularly in the creation of open world games. So people can expect a very high quality game to come out of somebody like CDPR, because they have had this history of these deep lore, right? Fully built worlds, but more importantly, a story that hasn't been told before. And this is something I think about a lot. There are so many really cool worlds that just never get told in like AAA games and AAA titles, like, or very rarely get told. Dragonlance, right? Like, or the Belgrade, like David Eddings books, or tons of fantasy universes and tons of Warhammer, right? Classically hasn't had like a AAA Hollywood movie or anything like that. And that's why people freak out about something like Astartes. If you've ever seen that on YouTube, they're like 4-minute shorts of Space Marines that get millions of views because people are so excited about it. Like, when you pull a world out of the dust and you put it in front of people and you make it a big thing, and it's already a full built world of lore, not only do you get all of the like kind of like underground fans of that place, because I was one of them. I love Shadowrun. Shadowrun is one of my favorite all-time worlds, and I talk about it all the time. Shadowrun is basically Cyberpunk, but with magic. So it's the same type of thing. So I played Cyberpunk Tabletop because I'm freaking 1,000 years old when Cyberpunk Tabletop was a thing. And I was really, really excited to hear, along with a bunch of other nerds, I think, that Cyberpunk was going to be a thing, because they took a world that has never been done before and they made it into something. And The Witcher was that as well. Like, The Witcher was this like really, really like obscure world that was like only wrote by like some Polish author in some books, but they made it into this like really incredible thing that now has like a Netflix special, like a Netflix like series, and Henry Cavill and everything. Because like what CDPR does is they take these existing worlds and they make them come alive. And there's so many opportunities in writing, in books, in movies to do this. And the other thing I think is that, like, making that world about sci-fi, I think sci-fi is really underrated. I think that not enough people respect science fiction and like the world of like the future and making games based on that. We don't see a lot of games like that come out that are like truly in the future, but close enough that we can relate to them. The one that I remember the most was Dishonored, which like also had that feel of like a sort of parallel world, but even then it was like kind of like very dystopian, very Victorian in a way that like wasn't familiar. But this is like Cyberpunk is like a society that like all of us can see ahead of us, and it's like a world that's like actually potential. The other thing that's underrated really is open world games. Um, and open world done right is almost always done well. So even games that didn't have the kind of hype, but like Outer World or Outward, all these games that had like open worlds were that I think were like mostly empty. Like Cyberpunk is like a truly open world where there's just stuff going on all over the place. These are things that I like still had like very good reception. And then the other thing I think I'm going to talk about is or the next section as a kind of weird transition because the transition, those are my thoughts on equity. The short of this basically is that Cyberpunk and CDPR have done the work beforehand to build confidence in their user base and make this game something that people can really look forward to and anticipate. And that's what creates like such rabid fans. The next one is decisions that matter. This is something that I talk about a lot, analogy Dark Souls. This is a kind of a hot take, especially among the executive world. I really don't think that players like to be babied. Over the last like 10 years in gaming, all we've heard about is accessibility. We should make games available to the most amount of people. Mobile games are like taking off, making games easier to use to like a wider audience. But what I actually think is I think at the core of people, if you take them seriously and you give them permission to invest in a serious game with serious consequences, with mature content, with romance options, with nudity, right? Like they'll do it. They'll invest in it. Dark Souls was that analogy, and Dark Souls bred an amazing amount of games. Like bred like 4 Dark Souls games, but Bloodborne. There's so many games that have come out of that series because Dark Souls didn't hold your hand, and it purposely set out to do that. And people appreciate Cyberpunk for the exact same virtue. I think that if you give players permission to be mature, then they do it. And in the same way that there's a interesting concept in marketing where there's been this like discussion over the past 10 years that attention spans are getting shorter. You've probably heard this, right? That we're all on TikTok now. We need 6-second sound bites. We need everything to be very short. We need everything to be like I got to get to the next thing. I got to jump through content. That's why we call them zoomers because they have to like they zoom through everything to get to the next thing. But then you have people like Joe Rogan, you have podcasts like Tim Ferriss. If you look at the most successful people in a lot of areas, they're doing very well thought out long form content. They're giving again, they're not holding your hand. They're like this is going to be a 45-minute video about why Cyberpunk is like this kind of game. And it's because I'm giving you permission to walk with me on a subject that requires a lot of thinking to sort of try to figure out why this game is the way that it is. And we're going to be able to go through every avenue of that. And we're going to be able to break this down point by point. It's going to be structured and it's going to take a lot of work, but we're going to get there and you're going to have a very deep understanding of why this game did what it did. And you can then tell that to your friends, or you can hold that within yourself. You can understand it for future marketing events or future business things. I think that's important because I'm giving you permission to invest in this discussion. I'm giving you permission to to put in the work versus a 2-minute video that's like, Cyberpunk is the greatest game anticipated, but here are the top 3 reasons. Number 2 will amaze you, right? And it's just like these very like general platitudes that you don't like really invest in. So I think that there's room for that. And I think that not only is there room for that, but that the most successful games that we're going to see in the next 10 years are going to have this, they're going to have this element to it. It's going to be something that doesn't hold your hand. It's going to have mature themes. It's going to have decisions you can't go back from. And it's going to have regret and pain and controversial subjects. And I think players are going to give permission to Cyberpunk to let them be impacted by that. Now, I want to talk about one of the number one things that I think is the biggest thing that Cyberpunk did that, as far as I know, no other game has done correctly or at all, if at all. And this is a awesome thing that Cyberpunk did. And I hope that someday we learn about the marketing here because, man, it is so cool. Cyberpunk is the first game in AAA that I know of that had an awesome brand representative. And that is Keanu Reeves. Keanu Reeves did so much work for this game at E3 when that trailer came out, and then the doors open, like the curtain opens, and Keanu Reeves walks out, who is widely regarded in gaming to be one of the most like authentic, awesome people. I cannot think of a better marketing plan than getting Keanu Reeves to star in your game. It was such a good idea. It was an insanely good marketing idea. Oh my god! Like at every level, and then, like obviously it was intentional. But like if you go look at the developers, and I did like to research doing this talk. If you go look at the developers and you're like, why did you get Keanu Reeves for this? The developers are so casual about it. They're just like, yeah, we just liked Keanu Reeves. And so we just like, hey, do you want to be in our game? And he was like, yeah. And it's like water finds its own level. You know, these people that are making this like very authentic experience with all of the things that we just mentioned invite one of the most authentic people to it who agrees because he is of that energy. He is of that essence. He wants to do that. He sees the art that they're making. And as a result, I mean, so many people connected to Cyberpunk that maybe wouldn't have connected to the world because the lore was like too weird or like it was like too futuristic for them. Whatever your reason was, Keanu Reeves being a part of Cyberpunk was such a massive influence on its success as a game. And I think like the ROI of investing in him in this game is the number one reason I think why the game is succeeding. And that it goes to show too that like this is not the only influencer integration that happened in Cyberpunk. And in fact, if we go check out our research notes and everything, there's actually a lot of influencers who got involved in Cyberpunk. And so here's Jesse Cox saying, I'm in Cyberpunk, like literally me. Here's Co Carnage saying, I'm in it. Here's Alana Pierce saying it. So there are a lot of influencers who actually were physically integrated into the game, which is something that hasn't really been done before. Now, I actually like, well, I actually think that this is really interesting. This is like something that I really want to talk about. In this case, a lot of the time, game success follows influencers. So in like the case of Among Us became a super hype game because of Twitch streamers and influencers and YouTubers. But in the case of Cyberpunk, I think it was actually the opposite. I think the game's hype led the influencers, and then it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The influencers got invested in Cyberpunk because Cyberpunk was a world worth getting invested to. And then Cyberpunk was able to approach these influencers and engage them in these ways. Like there's Co Carnage. Like it's like the people that are watching Co Carnage for the most part are probably going to buy Cyberpunk anyway. But all of this is just such a unique way of creating a parallel because Cyberpunk 2077 is so close to our real world already, right? It's not that far in the future, and all the stuff that's in Cyberpunk you can imagine might be here, and there might be things that we have to contend with later. So to add people that we identify with in a way that's authentic to the game is like such a genius marketing move. And when you actually go over the financials and everything, which we're going to do in a minute, for a AAA game, the budget was pretty reasonable for like what got done here. So I just wanted to bring this part up because I just think this is so cool. I think this is like such a neat thing that they integrated influencers in this way. But I also want to bring attention to it that I don't think this was the reason why Cyberpunk actually succeeded. As much as I do put a lot of value into influencers and the impact that they have on gaming, in this case, I think that for the reasons that we listed above, Cyberpunk was already well on its way to being an unbelievable success. And and again, like you may disagree and you may not like it. And like particularly with games that are this hype, there are going to be a lot of reasons not to like the game because there's a lot of things in the game. That's not the case that I'm trying to make for you here. Regardless of whether you like it or you dislike it, you have to respect the sheer amount of cultural impact that this game has created. And we're here to figure out why that happened. Okay, so let's get into the actual like marketing and budget and stuff. And we pulled up a bunch of really interesting stats on this. And I even looked at the financial sheet that Cyberpunk came up with. and it's in like Polish crowns or something, or some weird thing that uh we don't understand because it's not freedom money, so screw that. But at the end of the day, all you need to know is that as of June, the current investment for Cyberpunk was about $120 million. And it looks like they are going towards being a game that is about 175 million to 220 million when all is said and done, which is a good investment in a game. That would make it basically one of the top five most spent games in the in the history of gaming. But notably, um, one thing I really want to point out: half of the budget for Cyberpunk was invested in the development. The other half was invested in marketing. So another way to say that is that Cyberpunk 2077 and CDPR invested as much money into development as they did into marketing. Now, that should be something that you think a lot about, because that means that, and if you really think about everything that they've done and why you see this everywhere, it's going to start to make sense why that happened, right? Because when you think about it, when you spend that kind of money investing in a game for development costs, literally you just split it in half. 50% went into marketing. So typically that's going to look like 10 or 15% of your budget. With Cyberpunk, it was 50%. So it costs money. Like these influencer appearances that we were bringing up, and like Keanu Reeves and things like that. Like Keanu Reeves is in the entire game. Like this is an investment. They're basically making a movie with Keanu Reeves in it, right? Except it's longer than a movie, because a movie's 2 hours. So I think like I'm reading some articles, or when we were doing research for this, we I think we read that Keanu did them a solid, and so it wasn't like the same price as it would have been to get Keanu for like the equivalent of, I don't know, 15 movies or whatever. I don't know for sure. But it was certainly a big expense to get all of this done. Now, in combination with that, I don't know if any of you ever checked out any of like the PAX or E3 events or anything that before COVID happened, that CDPR put on. They were amazing. So when I went to E3, the Cyberpunk like the Cyberpunk like area was this gigantic booth that was like built out like Night City, and you would go inside the city, you would sit down, and you had like a one-on-one with like the developers, and they showed you gameplay. It was insane, right? And it's like, the thing is that only a few people are ever going to get access to that, but the reverb event of everybody talking about it, all this sort of adds up and becomes the sort of like total picture of Cyberpunk. Combine that with a ton of advertising everywhere. They're advertising on TV, they're advertising on Twitch, they're advertising on YouTube, they're advertising in gameplay. They have influencer advertising. They have influencer advertising getting the game early. There's a whole paid campaign for influencers. I mean, they have gone all out in terms of marketing. And I want to say that because it is meaningfully different from the way that someone like Activision or EA approaches this, right? So like Activision and EA will do the same type of stuff. They'll pay influencers. They may even have like actors in their games. Same type of thing. Like Death Stranding did this, like things like that, right? But the marketing is meaningfully different because everything that CDPR is doing is adding and building the lore of this world. That's the difference, right? It's again building onto that original concept of authenticity and equity that we discussed in the beginning. And so for that reason, there are games that have had AAA budgets but haven't had like a AAA influence like Cyberpunk has had on our culture. And the reason for that is because all of that marketing, you can spend marketing dollars any way you want. It's really easy to do. Believe me, I've seen so many tens of millions of dollars just get pissed into the wind by marketing executives. It's very easy to overspend on marketing, advertise everywhere, but not make an impact on people. The reason why they're able to do it is because it strikes an iron into the lore. It builds the foundation of this whole idea of what Cyberpunk is. And I think it does it with a fair amount of controversy too. All of the issues of Cyberpunk, oh, it's underhyped. It's overhyped. CDPR sucks, or CDPR is the best company ever. There's a lot of issues with gender issues in Cyberpunk. All these discussions, right? These are all discussions that add to the total narrative and the marketing and the idea that people are going to buy the game. If there's one thing that I have ever learned in marketing that I can impart upon you, it is that there is no such thing as bad publicity. And the more that people talk about this stuff, the more that people argue back and forth on Reddit, the more discussions that happen on Twitter about is it this or is it that, the bigger Cyberpunk gets, the more attention it gets, to the point where you'd have to live under a rock to not heard about it. And what people do is they might check out an article that's initially negative on it and then go read more, get interested in it, and buy the game. And like if there's anything we know about marketing, it's that it works this way, right? So it's very creative, and it's almost, I don't want to say it's intentional, but it's certainly beneficial to CDPR to put in these sort of these sort of controversial issues. And I mean, I would say that that's sort of accidental, because like if you have followed CDPR has always been controversial. The Witcher 3 was like a dark game in some ways, and you went on some quests and you finished them. I remember like sitting back from games. Some of the quests that happened in The Witcher, if you guys played through The Witcher 3, I would like stand back from some of those and I'd be like, damn, like that was rough. And like, that's controversial. Like, again, going back to those decisions that matter, is sometimes you can't take those back, or sometimes it feels really bad to do something and you had to think about it. Creating controversy like that in your games creates discussion points, which kind of inadvertently boosts marketing, and is something that YouTubers and Twitch streamers are now using and have used for years, to kind of like anchor their broadcasts and make themselves more popular. It's basically that sort of, if it bleeds, it leads kind of idea. So I think this is yet another reason to put very difficult / complex subjects and gameplay into your game, that it breeds this discussion and then kind of automatically like feeds into your marketing. So I think that's a huge aspect, as well as that controversy. More controversy, always good, to kind of like increase the sort of the value of your game. And when you combine it with the quality, you get the most anticipated game of all time. So love it or hate it, when somebody goes out into the world. Final closing thoughts. I love when somebody goes out into the world and they create something because they want to see it in the world and for no other reason. And you can always tell when someone does this, versus when somebody produces some manufactured sequel BS Call of Duty 17 game that you play for a month and then you're like, well, that's $60 I can never have back. When somebody does something for the art of doing it, you can always tell. That's why I started this talk off with the Musashi story. Like, at the end of that battle, he knew he would never face another opponent like that, because he knew that that person was totally and utterly committed to the art itself. Nothing else mattered. It wasn't about any money he was going to make from the fight. It wasn't about any fame. If I have one concern for CDPR, it's this. It's that I think this may be the last game that comes out of CDPR that is like this. Because when Cyberpunk started as a project, it wasn't this whole thing. And I feel like now going forward, the anticipation and the weight of it will be so much that it will crush any attempt at real artistry and creativity, which needs to exist uninterrupted to be successful. This is probably the most important thing I'm going to say. I'm terrified that CDPR becomes a company that is just another one of those like triple A, like what happened to Blizzard. Like, Blizzard's like a really good example of this. It's like Blizzard started off and was like creating games for the art of it, for the sake of it, because they want to see those games in the world. This is how you got some of the best games ever. Like, you got Diablo 2, right? It's like one of the best games ever made, because that game was made by people who absolutely loved the game. And I'm worried that that becomes Warcraft Reforged, right? Which is just an utter abomination. It's just insulting that that game exists even to this day. But how do you make a freaking sequel that's worse than the original? The answer is you lose sight of like why you were there in the first place. And I hope I'm wrong. If there's one thing that I really want to be wrong on, it's this. It's that I hope that like CDPR stays in it for the art, but man, it gets so hard. You have 500 developers. Everybody's looking at your every move. Oh, is it crunch time? Is it not crunch time? Oh, there's a woman in this game and we can't have that. Like Battlefield, right? EA gets like on and on and on. There's so many social and cultural and economic and freaking publisher issues, and companies get sold and equity gets shared and your stock price goes up. It becomes impossible to just sit down and create something amazing. But that's what every gamer at their core wants. That's why Terraria was so successful, because it was a guy in his basement that just wanted to create something cool. That's why Dark Souls worked. That's why all great games come to fruition. And like triple A studios are just dropping like flies. Blizzard, EA, Activision. It's like Ubisoft. Just everything dropping because the pressure becomes too great and it doesn't become about the art anymore. So like Cyberpunk might be like one of the last games we see until this position, like until someone, like a new developer, dethrones them and creates a game that's really worth playing out of the sake of doing it. It all goes back to that authenticity thing. Creating something for the soul of making it happen. Making a masterpiece just because you want that to exist in the world. Because you have the passion to do it. That's what Cyberpunk did, and that's why it's the most anticipated game of all time. I just think I hope you've enjoyed joining me in this sort of quest, this sort of journey to discover why this game is the way that it is. Because it was one of the coolest research projects I've ever done to like really look into what made this game successful and think about it. I love to see marketing in its full, true form exist, and nothing really shows like the power of authentic marketing that Cyberpunk 2077 has shown. So I hope you enjoyed this talk as much as I have enjoyed making it. And I will see you again next time. What I don't do a lot is I don't say subscribe, but that is what you should do. If you are listening to this talk on YouTube, please do subscribe to the channel, as I do a lot of deep dives into industry and gaming type stuff like this. So if you like this and you want to see more of it, please do click that button. It helps. We just passed 100K, which is fantastic as of the time of this talk. So hope you enjoy this, and we will see you again next time.